everyone. Welcome to today's Digit Debates. I'm Mark Stewart, the co-director of Digit with Jackie O'Reilly. I'm based at the University of Leeds and Jackie's based at the University of Sussex. So the Digital Futures at Work Research Centre was launched at the start of this year, supported by a large research centre grant from the Economic and Social Research Council. And where we've got a programme of research for the next 5 years supported by the ESRC. So I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Professor Debra Howcroft. Debra is a professor of technology and organisation based at Alliance Business School at the University of Manchester, where she's also a member of the Work and Equalities Institute. So Debra's research covers new technologies and organising with particular reference to work and employment. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with Debra's work. She's published prolifically in the area. Debra's been the editor-in-chief of the journal New Technology, Work and Employment since 2011. That's dedication to the cause, Debra. And she's also the co-lead of one of the core Digit research themes, Reconnecting the Disconnected, New Channels of Voice and Representation. Debra's talk today is entitled A Typology of Crowdwork Platforms. So over to you, Debra.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. Thank you also for the invitation today to give this talk. And the talk is based on a paper that has been published in WES and is co-authored with Birgitta Bergvall-Karabon, who's based in Luleå in Sweden. So in terms of the format for the presentation today, it's going to be in 3 parts. So the first part, I'm going to look at the sort of background and common characteristics of platforms. And then the centre will be based on the presentation of the typology. So the aim of the typology is to provide a review of platform work by synthesising empirical findings and issues from a variety of different literatures. And then the final part will look at the implications for work and employment. And just to say at the outset that my focus will be on externally facing labour platforms. So I just wanted to start off here with looking at this kind of variety of terminology that's used. I'm not interested in providing definitions, but I want to show how the landscape has shifted over time. Because I think that these origins are important, particularly the notion of collaborative consumption or peer-to-peer sharing is kind of fundamental in terms of the way in which it bolsters the claims of platforms that they are technological intermediaries. And this claim is one that's fueled with the expansion of platforms and also has attracted significant sums of venture capital. So obviously a common term that's used is that of the sharing economy, and there's a large literature associated with that. And the sharing economy started in the US, and for me it seemed to bypass the UK, which was kind of leapfrogged straight to the gig economy. But at the same time, sort of sitting alongside the sharing economy is the concept of crowdsourcing. And here this distinction emerges as how categorically relates crowdsourcing to outsourcing rather than peer production and co-creation. And I think the other issue to note here is that just within a decade from when the term crowdsourcing was initially coined, the growth and scale of platform work has led numerous commentators to say that we're seeing a fundamental transformation of work, which signifies a radical shift. So why have we seen this growth? Well, I think common explanations kind of focus on things like technological innovation, coupled with capital search for new forms of exploitation and labour arbitrage. But I think context matters here. So we have to think about wider ranging changes in work and employment. And also this is on the back of the financial crisis and period of austerity, which drives increasing numbers of people to platform work. So we think about the diversity of perspectives within this field, and like I say, there's so many different disciplinary areas that contribute, and they tend to have a different focus and a different object of study. There's been a lot talked about business benefits, and in the employment relations literature, this has been a much more keen focus on worker experiences. And we can see this particularly in terms of like the critical literature, which has tended to focus predominantly on ride hailing and food delivery. And there's also a critical literature that looks at mechanical Turk as well. So a lot of the research has tended to focus on individual case studies as opposed to cross-platform analysis. So what I would like to do is just to outline some of the common characteristics, but at the same time, I want to make clear that platform work is extremely diverse on so many different levels. And I think that there's a very important distinction which has been made by colleagues in Leeds between workers who are platform dependent in terms of their income and those who use it as a supplementary form of income. So I want to run through a few defining features, but I want to focus on the pivotal role played by the platform itself, because that then shapes the other elements. So if we look at the platform, I think if we hope to understand the significance of platforms, we need to follow the money. Now, I take Paul Thompson's point that we should be looking at actual existing capital, and that only 2 of the top 50 companies globally in terms of revenue are tech giants, Apple and Amazon. But nevertheless, I think that there is a long-standing belief that tech firms are likely to deliver big payouts. And so we're witnessing a gold rush mentality, which raises broader questions about valuation bubble. So we've seen an influx of influential young companies that are keen to be seen as posing a serious threat to established industry incumbents and as thus deeply disruptive. So the notion of disruptive technology features a lot in the writing. And I think if we compare this with .coms, we see that financial interests supporting platform firms focus on the much more longer term pursuit of winner takes all returns and the hope of future payoff. And so we're seeing a more patient form of capital investment, allowing firms to maintain an asset-light balance sheet and remain loss-making for longer. So if we think of this in the context of Uber's deficits will put most firms into liquidation, yet they still continue to subsidise fares and provide financial incentives to sign-ups because they're chasing monopolisation, which is why venture capital is tolerant of an unprofitable present in the hope of future market domination. So the thing with platforms is that there's actually no consistent definition of what constitutes a platform or a platform business model. But platforms identify as neutral parties, and they argue that they're serving as middlemen in managing what economists call a two-sided market, even though they play an orchestrating role and digitally curate each interaction and transaction. And being positioned as an intermediary enables platforms to emphasize that they are tech firms, which then attracts lots of speculative capital. And this belief in platforms extends to the belief in platform business models, which tend to be viewed as something essentialist, based on things like the value proposition or the revenue model, competitive environment. And so we see, lots of reviews in places, lots of articles in places like Harvard Business Review, that's kind of celebrating the transformative platform business model of companies like Uber. Well, the problem with this kind of fixed view of business model is that when investors lose interest, firms can quickly lose legitimacy, even though the business model may remain exactly the same. So given that so many startups and platforms present as a disruptor, they need to attract capital and sustain growth. So many cultivate an oppositional stance to incumbent organisations, almost verging on the evangelical in order to persuade investors to back them. So many new platform firms also levered the sharing economy as a useful credentialing mechanism. So it provides familiarity and plausibility. And you see this in the case of Uber, who adopted the inclusive language of ride sharing and referred to taxi drivers as partners. So it's a strategy that's very much geared on stimulating network effects, where the value of the platform increases the more the people use it. And these firms are prioritising rapid upscaling and extracting revenues from circulations and associated data trails. So the benefits accrue to those that make it beyond a tipping point and become hard to dislodge, leading to extreme dominance by a few large corporations. So how do platforms recruit labour? So they have a number of strategies, and they're quite keen to emphasise this, that they offer flexibility. It's the lifestyle of a digital nomad, the promise of selecting when and where and how you work. And of course, it's characterised by openness. There's few barriers to entry, because if you want to generate effects, network effects, and expand quickly, then you need as many people as possible to join the network. From the perspective of capital, crowds can process large quantities of data in a short time frame. So this enables the exploitation of geographical differences and labour cost arbitrage. For labour, the tasks tend to be very tightly bounded, as digitisation facilitates work fragmentation. So there can be a lot of unpaid time simply searching and bidding for scraps of work. A lot of the encounters are largely transactional rather than relational, representing an extreme form of commodification. So these appeals to flexibility are also mirrored in the narrative of being your own boss, and particularly the notion of being a micro entrepreneur, that you can monetize those things that are just hanging around, like your car or your bike or your spare room. And identifying as a tech firm rather than a taxi firm or a retailer boosts the notion of a platform and their own self-identification as a digital matching service. Hence, workers are classified as independent contractors. But if platforms really are mere middlemen, then workers as independent contractors would not be brought into question. But should platforms have to fulfill employer obligations, then many would cease to be financially viable, given their ability to undercut competitors would diminish. They are built like a house of cards. So in terms of algorithmic control, there's an expansive literature on this, and there's a lot of excitement generally around algorithms. I think the notion of technological control at work is not new, and there's lots of classic examples, such as Taylor and Bain's article in 1999 on the assembly line in the head, and their study of the application of computer telephony in call centres. But the problem, of course, is that with algorithms, the practices are opaque. Yet at the same time, they seem to have some sort of aura about them. So algorithms serve as a proxy for management. And given that many platforms base their success on the rapid scalability of labour, directly assessing the quality of the labour process is both time-consuming and costly. So direct management control is replaced with algorithms which evaluate interactions with minimal intervention from the platform, and are seen to serve as a semblance of quality assurance. Because of course, if there was an actual line manager or supervisor, the notion of an independent contractor would be difficult to sustain, and platforms would be under pressure to pay wages and the associated costs. Instead, they prefer to provide nudges in the form of automated messages, and these messages are intended to incentivize, to homogenize, and generally control how workers function within the system. Now, trust is also seen as kind of critical to platform credibility, and it's assumed that reliability can be measured in digital ratings. And in fact, some even argue that the reputation economy is indeed far fairer than one that's based on hierarchies. But having to access future work on the basis of online ratings, which lack any sort of form of standardisation and are associated with discriminatory practices, is highly problematic. And I think the crucial difference here with a non-platform organisation is that much as we hate our bosses, if we feel we're being treated unfairly, there is usually some form of redress, whereas with platforms, you're simply deactivated. So now I'd like to look at the typology. And the purpose of a typology is to reduce this sort of multitude of examples into a lesser number of classes which share key attributes. So it serves as a heuristic device to represent concepts, and it's rather than empirical cases. And the formation of the typology is based on the literature review, and it's also based on empirical work that I've carried out along with two colleagues, Birgitta and also Claire Mumford, based in Manchester. And that's informed my understanding as well. So if we look at the typology, we can see here that what this does is it basically puts the whole kind of complexity of the world into a 2x2 matrix which some may argue is one of its limitations. And so what we have here is one-sided accentuation of types of remuneration, payment type, and also initiating actor. So with paid work, the platform specifies the payment level for the task so that when it's completed, the worker can assume that they will receive the fee that they're due. For non-paid or speculative, the worker contributes the labour, and this may or may not result in future payment. For the initiating actor type, there are requesters and workers. Requesters, I don't really like the term requesters, but I think it's better than consumers and customers. And also requesters, of course, can refer to large firms. So they can be private companies, and they can initiate transactions by posting requests. Workers may also initiate the transaction by offering their products, services, or skills. So I'll start off by looking at type A, which is online task work. And what we see here with online task work is that the tasks are modular, ranging from sort of micro tasks to more complex macro tasks, such as website production and graphic design. The payment is comparatively low, and even for more macro tasks, they tend to be a lower cost service than their bricks and mortar counterparts. The tasks are often subject to extensive tailorization and are largely undertaken by individuals working in isolation. And so the only interaction really is with customers, although that's very limited. A lot of workers are assigned a unique identifier, which is this sort of random string of numbers and letters. And this abstracts away the human attributes and dehumanizes the process. So in terms of some of those examples, Mechanical Turk serves as an emblematic case. It's been extensively written about. It was set up, probably because it was set up in 2005 and also owned by Amazon. But more recent ethnographic research. Sorry, this is just it's the weekly fire alarm at work. Apologies for that. I thought there'd been benefits of coming into the office. Yes, so ghost work. So this ethnographic research by Gray and Sura, that they employ the concept of ghost work to refer to the way in which hundreds of companies offer an on-demand service to sort through and sift through the data that consumers produce when interacting online. So these platform workers intervene on behalf of tech firms to repair glitches that automated tools are unable to solve. So it's things like ensuring that mobile phone apps and websites and AI applications work effectively. And in that respect, they make the internet seem smart. So through these platforms, an on-demand, poorly paid shadow labour force is employed on a piecework basis. But the benefits extend beyond low cost, because ghost work also contributes to the creation of a massive data set, which is then used by platforms for machine learning to develop better AI with a view to reducing human labour. So the second type B, is that of Playboy. Now, Playboy is so much more than a made-up word, and it's also an ideological strategy that associates pleasure and fun with labour. It links to the notion of the creative class and the belief that if work is fun, and has a fun side to it, then worker productivity will increase. In the case of Playboy, people aren't turning to it as a replacement for work or even for supplementary income, but there is the distinct hope of prize money. It also serves as a way of building up reputation and learning to labour in sort of standings terms. And in that respect, I think it's similar to unpaid internships. So most of the examples of Playboy sit within two main areas of literature. The first is that within innovation, particularly citizen science, with the platform Innocentive regularly being trotted out as a forum for the democratisation of idea generation, with solvers winning cash prizes. And the second area is that of software development. And so the focus really is on how Playboy is used for the development process as opposed to the actual work experiences of the developers themselves. And Topcoder has pioneered this. So they're one of the largest platforms, and requesters, which are often large companies, They pay a monthly fee to the platform and propose projects, which are then decomposed and carried out by a multitude of different developers who are all proposing solutions. And then, like I say, it's a competition, so you get the winner and the runner-up receive these lottery-like payments. So you do get quite a bit of money for it, but of course the chances of receiving it are very slim. And it also leads to the hope that you'll have a reputation as a talented developer. Now, type C is that of asset-based services, and this is one area that's been written about extensively in the work and employment literature. Many of these platforms have been built on the back of the sharing economy, and they're based on real-world exchanges. A lot of the activities are conducted offline, usually face-to-face, and they rely on the assets of workers, allowing platforms to reduce their costs to a bare minimum. So this type of work has been described as hyper-outsourced, in that it enables platforms to literally monetize and digitize informal work and informal sector working. So the types of cash-in-hand activities that previously operated on the margins. Now, working in this ideal type is time and place dependent, and so there's obvious geographical limitations, and it also means that the network effects are localized. But in the US, this works to the advantage of platforms such as Uber, as it exploits local rather than national loopholes, and it gives Uber far greater negotiating power, as decisions made in one city are not binding on another. So the nature of the interaction in this type means that trust and security issues become fairly prevalent. And so this ideal type is seen as being at the cutting edge of algorithmic regulation, whereby traditional forms of consumer protection are replaced with online ratings. Now, emotional labour has long been sort of key to all types of interactive service work, but it takes on new resonance when we're given the nature of evaluations, as workers are judged on each activity by customers themselves. And questions have been raised as to whether or not customers are actually qualified to provide a fair and objective evaluation, given that these negative reviews can serve as a disciplinary instrument. So when writing critical reviews, this is not about providing information to other peers, but it acts as a complaint to the platform itself, many of which have their own unaccountable disciplinary systems that can remove workers for any reason. And the final type that I want to cover is that of type D, which is profession-based freelance work. So this type of work is often speculative. So workers tend to upload products and content, but there's no guarantee that payment will follow. Professional work on platforms is largely under-researched, I would say, compared to other areas. And much of it might be seen as being similar to traditional self-employed practices. And so many would perhaps not see themselves as being misclassified in terms of their employment status. But this doesn't mean it's not problematic. The issue is the presence of massive power asymmetries. So while some may welcome platforms and the infrastructure that serves as a sort of marketing and distribution channel, they can, and in fact do, become industry bottlenecks to the extent that workers have little option other than to go through the platform. So the example that I use to illustrate this is that of mobile apps on iOS and Android, and the duopoly created by Apple and Google. So when you actually consider the sheer quantity of content on phones, and imagine just how much this would have cost Apple and Google if they had employed developers directly, we can see how this is a classic example of the risk shift. Not only does the externally provided content drive sales of phones, and there are big profit margins to be made here in terms of hardware, but it also benefits Apple directly, as they value skim 30% from each transaction. So $26 billion is not a trivial sum. And this example, I think, in terms of the change in the environment for software developers, really illustrates that it can only be fully understood within the context of restructuring within the IT sector and the changing nature of software development work. And in that respect, platform work is not separate from non-platform work. So in the final part of the presentation, I'd like to ask the question, what are the implications? And to look at three main areas in this context. So in terms of regulation, platform regulation seems to confound policy makers. And there's certainly an increase in regulatory activity, which is obviously positive, and there's more and better challenges. But unfortunately, I still think we're witnessing little material change. Platforms operate in a regulatory sweet spot and stress that they should be regulated as technology firms. So the aim of this, of course, is to bypass standard regulations, since this may slow growth. So many operate in regulatory grey areas, openly challenging incumbent rules and structures and engaging in what's been described as regulatory arbitrage. So platforms frame the existing regulations as an anti-competitive block on new entrants. But scaling at speed is critical. Yet the faster platforms grow and the more competitors they put out of business, the greater their hold-up power, which increases the social costs of regulatory sanction, making platforms too big to ban. But it's a high-stakes game. If platforms want to expand quickly, they operate in legal grey areas, but operating in those areas exposes them to reputational damage and sanction, which could then undermine their capacity to grow. In order to scale quickly and become too big to ban, the regulatory grey area around the labour contract are exploited. Taking advantage of gaps in employment law reduces transaction costs associated with growth, spurring expansion with less risk. And again, this is this classification as a tech firm, which is being used as an excuse to get around the problems of being an employer. So there are numerous ongoing lawsuits regarding misclassification. But if you look at the legal challenges to the employment status of Uber drivers, for example, most have actually found against Uber, but Uber's response has been to appeal and then to stall for time, which is why there's little real change. Because the problems are of having to shoulder the sort of responsibilities of real employers would seriously undermine the business model narrative and the prospects of big eventual payouts for investors. So platforms persist in their resistance to existing employment regulation. But this is not that unique and mirrors many of the facets of non-standard employment and the shift of employment-related risk to workers. So in terms of collective organising and resistance, when work is digital and globally dispersed, it poses unique challenges to building collective voice. It might be easy to assume that the basis for building solidarity could be expected to be far weaker than traditional Fordist workplaces. But what we're actually seeing is lots of really exciting developments and activity in this area. And I'd strongly recommend that you check out the Leeds Index of Platform Labour Protest for material on this. So in the UK, we've seen the first organic and bottom-up trade union in over a century in terms of the IGWB. And this includes gig economy workers. Their recent campaign, for example, is fighting an end-to-end unfair key worker termination by Deliveroo and Uber Eats. And there's also many, many examples of resistance, and I've just cited a few here. But just focusing on the Delete Uber social media campaign in 2017. This was triggered when Uber tried to capitalise on a New York taxi strike. This went viral. And it served as a focal point around a lot of other negative stories which began to emerge. And this had really serious consequences because in November of that very same year, Uber faced difficulties in raising equity funding. So we're seeing an increasing number of workers building active solidarity. And this is emerging in various forms and is linked to the inherent contradictions within the capitalist labour process. So the third element that I want to consider is that of control and coordination. So the compulsion to generate surplus value is often associated with the need for discipline and surveillance. But as Theo Nichols reminds us, generating surplus value is not simply about the control of labour power. And I think with platforms, there's generally less concern with explicit control, since the production of products and services merely represents one element in the wider circuit of capital. Platforms generate value from circulation and the process of exchange. So coordinating that process efficiently is really critical to platforms' development and growth, as are these kind of coordination mechanisms to foster upscaling. So the model is based on attracting large numbers of users, reaping economies of scale, building a critical mass, value skimming each transaction, expanding the market share while hopefully wiping out competitors along the way, and then aiming for a jackpot IPO. So last week in the DigiDebates talk, Juliet Shaw described platforms in terms of the retreat from control, which she sees as the linchpin of understanding the uniqueness of platform work. I think it's fair to say I don't see control in quite the same way as Juliet. So platform intermediation has a distinct logic, and that's based on network connections and the curating of digital connectivity. It's creating a networked mode of market dominance based primarily on direct ownership of technology as opposed to control of labour, but control of labour becomes an outcome of these emergent systems. So it's the combination of nudges, metrics, ratings, independent contractor status, and a very fragmented labour process, which leads to more subtle forms of control, which is no less powerful. So the independent contractor status leaves workers both dependable and disposable, to use Hyman's terms. As platforms expand, they create dependence, especially if they're wiping out competitors. At the same time, by transferring risk to workers themselves, they also become disposable, which is particularly useful for platforms that face regulatory sanction and are aiming to kind of scarper from a territory fairly quickly. So in the absence of direct control, platforms invest in infrastructure, and this infrastructure controls each and every transaction in the functioning environment. So as Aaron Shapiro illustrates in his work, platforms adopt these strategies of arbitrage between worker autonomy and worker control. So they're aiming to satisfy the sort of legal criteria for worker autonomy, while at the same time exerting control over workforces to minimise the associated costs. So just to round off with some final remarks. Firstly, just to say that I don't take the view that platform work represents a fundamental change in work organisation, but I see it as part of a much bigger picture of work-related change. I'm also not arguing that change is determined by technological innovation, but it arises from the coming together of a particular conjunctural context, financial markets, technology developments, and changing labour markets. Yet by arguing this, I don't mean to imply that technology itself doesn't matter, because technology embodies specific forms of power and authority and can direct a particular way of ordering human activity. Digital technologies are designed and implemented under conditions where power resides with capital, not labour, and where technological systems are developed to serve the interests of capitalist firms. Consequently, they shape the direction, experience, and evaluation of working practices and processes. So of concern, I think, just to end with this, is the ways in which some of the attributes of platform work travel beyond platforms. So as capitalism continues to seek out new ways of extracting surplus value. As we saw in the case of outsourcing, which has been extensively researched, this model of organising began to permeate more traditional forms of work. And I think that this is what we're likely to see with platform type work. So as tasks are digitally decomposed and workers contend with piece rate pay structures while firms reap the benefits. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. It's a great presentation. So just to remind participants that we are open for questions, and you can present your questions in two ways. So firstly, you can write the question in the Q&A. So just go to the Q&A button on the bottom of the bar, and you can put your question in there. And I can then read the questions to Deborah. Or secondly, you can use the raise hand function, and I will try to bring colleagues in so that they can ask questions directly themselves. Although from previous experiences, we can go through more questions actually by just going through the written versions. So Deborah, you can see that there's a couple of questions already in the Q&A. So the first is from Joe Ellery at the SRC, who asks, you mentioned about an increasing shift to platform work as a result of the financial crisis. Do you see any significant changes that might result from the COVID-related unemployment over the coming years, platforms or otherwise? So maybe the question is the extent to which the current crisis may accelerate the trends, or whether there's any specific changes you see as related to COVID.
Shall I answer that now, Mark? Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, great, thanks. Yeah, yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, I think that the pandemic is going to have a sort of massive impact. Obviously, we're only just starting to see the kind of increasing levels of unemployment and kind of austerity measures being introduced. So I imagine that this will significantly impact the uptake of platforms. But what's interesting, actually, even if you look at the pandemic and you look at platforms and how they've developed, some have benefited extremely well. So obviously Amazon have now got the infrastructure of most kind of Western states in terms of their sort of network, and they've kind of benefited financially from that. Whereas other firms like, excuse me, Uber, sort of like personal rides services have been hit badly. But I think the biggest impact that we'll see is that there'll be a big increase in terms of the one side of the two-sided market, which is the people who are actually wanting to work on platforms. So I think we'll see an intensification of what Juliet describes as the downward trajectory. So the downward trajectory is something that we're already witnessing in terms of platform work, and I think that this will just be exacerbated once the kind of fallout from COVID starts to play out more fully.
Okay, that's great. So we have another question, but colleagues, I'd encourage you to please put your questions into the Q&A or to raise your hand. I'm sure there's lots of questions that people would like to ask. So Joseph Walton is asking about cooperatives. He'd love to hear if you have any thoughts about more positive, democratic, equitable visions for platform-wise work, whether that's platform cooperativism or alternative for-profit business models that mitigate exploitative practices while genuinely delivering on some of the promises of worker flexibility, new affordances for more playful, collaborative working practices.
Yeah, thank you. I think the area of platform co-ops is an interesting one, and there's a lot of work being done in the US by Nathan Schneider and Trevor Schultz who are looking at this. And of course, co-ops are just a different type of firm that operate within platform work. And I'm broadly supportive of co-ops, platform co-ops, because of course it's an improvement in terms of working conditions and ways of operating. So I do see the benefits of that. But just like the non-platform economy, it's good to see co-ops, but co-ops are just literally tinkering around the margins, unfortunately. And for me, we need a whole kind of cooperative form of society for this to work effectively, rather than just isolated examples, which are clear improvements and to be welcomed, but it just needs to be on a much bigger scale for me.
Okay, thank you. So colleagues, any further questions? Okay, we have a question from someone called Jackie O'Reilly, who I'm sure we all know. Do you have any evidence of how the public sector might be using platforms to organize their work, particularly since COVID, when so many organizations, both in the public and private sector, have been working online from home? Do you think that these trends will encourage traditional employers to rethink how they organize their internal workforce and encourage a change to these kinds of internal forms of labor?
Yeah, I think in terms of rethinking internal forms of labour, I think one of the issues with platforms, like I say, in terms of its encroachment into what's traditionally seen as non-platform work, is a real concern, actually. This notion of being able to just pay people on a kind of piecework basis, and to be able to just decompose tasks into small pieces of work. So I suspect that in the future we're likely to see more of that sort of encroachment into public sector, especially given the current economic context, and obviously the Tory government's desire to cut public sector spending in whichever way they can. So I would anticipate seeing more of that in the future. And I think that there are examples, particularly in terms of things like care work, how platforms are used as well. But of course, it's not like the public sector is immune to things like using zero-hour contract workers or temporary agency workers. So I think that this is probably just the next step.
Okay. Okay, there's a question from Steve Rolfe. He's been reading Zuboff, Katharina Pistor and others, and they've started to argue that platforms mean markets are being somehow replaced by rule by data. And he wonders if you've encountered this argument, and were you rejecting it in your final slides in arguing that this is an entrenchment of capitalist rule?
So, sorry, Mark. So the Zuboff's argument that platforms are ruled by data?
That started to argue that platforms mean markets are somehow replaced by rule by data.
Oh, yeah.
Are you familiar with the argument, or is it something that you reject?
I think the data aspect is interesting, of course, because there's massive monetization associated with these data trails and the capture of data. I don't think I would go along entirely with Zuboff's argument, because I think it's more complex than that. It's about so much more than data. It is about things like it's also about, like I say, this kind of conjunctural context, venture capital, and also labour markets, and why labour is attracted to using platforms. But I think the issue of the way in which data is being used is interesting, particularly, like I say, in the ghost work example, in that what is happening over time is that tasks which are seen as really quite trivial and are just being solved by platform workforce, they then collect the data and they use that as a form of machine learning to then build better AI systems. And so that the next time that they're asking for tasks to be solved, they're almost like at a level higher. So it's this kind of like removal of the lower layer of labour to solve a lot of these practices. So it's quite interesting the way that the data is being used. And of course, data is also being used in terms of advertising, Google being an obvious example, selling data. Yeah.
Okay, good. Question from Abby Winton. Can you talk a bit about the key differences which you observed in your work looking at Amazon Mechanical Turk and the legal sector?
Yeah.
I imagine people experience similar issues, even though the legal work is professionalized. Yeah,
thanks, Abby. Yeah, there are real differences, actually. In terms of Mechanical Turk, like I said, they both almost fall into this type A of the typology, in that it's online task work. And it's the difference between micro tasks and macro tasks. And what I've seen in both areas, actually, is that some people work on Mechanical Turk for full-time, as a primary source of income, and also supplementary, and I saw the same as well in the legal sector. But what was interesting, actually, particularly if I could just talk about the work on the legal sector, is that I looked at people per hour platform and also lawyers on demand. So in contrast to Juliet's work on the difference between the supplemental form of income and the dependent form of income, I actually found the opposite. So Juliet would argue that for those workers who use platforms as a supplementary form of income, they have got greater levels of autonomy and they've got greater levels of satisfaction. And they also receive better pay. Whereas I actually found the opposite in terms of legal services. So what I found was that, and this is where the sort of gender differences came into play, so that a lot of women legal practitioners tended to use the platform as an additional source of income. And I would argue that that's because of the context of the legal profession and the sort of discriminatory practices and inequalities that exist within that legal profession. And so many of those women were actually using the platform as a supplementary form of income. But when you're actually using it for supplementary income, it's very hard when you're constantly bidding for work. So things like timeliness and having templates ready actually worked against them. So by contrast, the much more sort of male-dominated element of legal work, for most of the men that worked on the platform, they were all actually dependent earners, so that they worked pretty much full time. And some of them earned a lot of money. They were earning up to like 200,000 a year in terms of income, so massive amounts of money. But what I saw there is that because they were able to build on their experience and expertise of the legal profession and almost built an old boys network, if you like, where they actually contacted other people on the platform, and they would actually trade work between each other as well. But what I found with these people who were dependent on the platform for a primary source of income is that their work expertise enabled them to bid quickly, to build templates, and to build up a client base. And so, like I say, in contrast with Juliet's finding, they were actually the most satisfied, the better paid, and the most experienced the most autonomy. Now, in terms of this kind of contrast with the legal sector and Mechanical Turk, obviously, just in terms of personal identity, Mechanical Turk use these alphanumeric identifiers, which, like I say, are really dehumanizing. The legal sector, it's much more about your profile, your ratings play a part, but less so. What really fascinated me was that people just didn't actually, a lot of the workers weren't even bothered that much about online ratings. They needed it to get the first job, but beyond that, they didn't really have much concern or worry about it. For Mechanical Turk workers, it's completely different, of course, because unless you actually have a rating of a certain standard or level, then you're actually excluded from some jobs. They're just not even displayed to you. So that rating is really important in terms of access to work. Whereas, like I say, with the legal sector, it wasn't. Massive differences in pay as well. And also, obviously, the size of the task. So thank you for asking that.
Yeah, it's really interesting stuff there around the dependency and supplemental income dimensions and the extent to which particular contexts might matter, because I think the types of work that people are doing is really important in terms of supplemental income, and we need to also look at the other jobs, not necessarily just the work they're doing on the platforms. I think picking up a bit on this, Sylvia Massiero, are there ways to use your taxonomy to illuminate effects of digital platform work across genders, especially impacts of involvement of digital platform work on women workers? Touched on this already a little bit.
Yeah. I think so. I think if you actually look at a lot of the asset-based services, I'd say that that's predominantly male platform workers. And I think that if you look at some of the sort of MTurk or sort of online digital work, there's probably more inclined to be more women workers there. So I think it really does vary. And especially things like the issue in terms of gender, the issues of Playboy, how many women have seriously got time to be engaging in Playboy activities? So I think that there are obviously gender, I imagine, will actually weave throughout that whole kind of typology in terms of the different areas. So yeah, thank you for that question. Good point.
Okay, my colleague at Leeds, Sandeep Alakar, is picking up on some of the points you made in reference to legal services. She notes there's a difference between elite lawyers and non-elite platforms as virtual firms organizing elite work specifically recruit lawyers from top firms. But I suspect due to disaggregation, there's a precarious workforce for non-elite work.
Yeah.
So I guess that's a comment rather than a
question.
Yeah,
no, I agree actually. And I mean, Juliet talked about a platform hierarchy in terms of, you know, Airbnb at the top and Uber at the bottom, if you like. But I think that you've also got platform hierarchy within particular sectors as well, so that you do have those elite platforms. And then the platform that I looked at, like I say, people per hour, I would say if you were trying to put it into some sort of hierarchy, that was at a much lower level than lawyers in demand, because lawyers on demand were much more focused on people who are who is predominantly women workers actually, who worked at top firms who were looking for part-time flexible working. So they were using their platform in that way. Whereas people per hour was seen by some as a race to the bottom. So more the sort of clearly defined tasks, activity, as opposed to much more sort of detailed legal work.
Okay. We've got time for a couple more questions, if anyone would like to put their questions forward. Glenn Morgan, how does your typology of platform work impact on spatial locations of employment? The asset-based services are clearly location dependent, but what about the other parts of the typology? In particular, where might co-working spaces fit here?
Yeah, I'm not sure where co-working spaces would fit there actually, but I think that in terms of, I think Playboy, the online tasks and the kind of profession-based freelance work tends to be much more online and digitally based compared with the asset-based kind of ideal type. And I think in terms of if you look at the examples, say, of developers on Apple and Google, then while they have a lot of online interaction, there's also that the importance of locality as well. So when we actually talk to developers in places like Edinburgh, who were based in these kind of like incubation startups, what we found was that although a lot of their interactions were online, it was often with the local community that they already knew. And so they would have regular face-to-face meetups, maybe, you know, with these things like, you know, Java night and First Monday sort of events. So it was based on relationships that existed within the community, but a lot of the interaction was done online. So I think in terms of co-working spaces, that might work in that sense, so that people can actually build those relationships with each other. And those kinds of practices in terms of, if you like, informing on platforms in terms of which are better platforms than others and who pays properly and who treats workers decently, then that kind of environment could encourage that kind of collaboration in terms of understanding how platforms operate, which to use and which to avoid.
Okay. So colleagues, I think we can take maybe one more question, one or two. I mean, I'll ask one myself while people maybe think about putting something down. Just picking up on one of your final points around regulation and classification, and you gave some examples of sort of worker-led campaigns and maybe some of the activities of newer trade unions, more grassroots unions. I just wondered if you could say something about maybe what this means for established trade unions and their ability to organize workers in platforms and maybe establish some form of collective bargaining. Obviously, there's huge challenges in this space, but just wondered if you had any sort of thoughts or insights.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's seen as quite fractured. Actually, I don't think it has to be. So I think that there are real challenges for established trade unions, but then you also see the GMB in terms of London and the case that they've been involved in. So it's not that they're excluded from this territory at all, actually. And I think for me, it's about the coming together of all these various elements. So it is established trade unions, it's new trade unions like the Independent Workers Union, and it's also grassroots activity as well. So I don't think these things are necessarily mutually exclusive. It's about bringing it all together. But of course, there are challenges in terms of organising. And when you actually look at it, it's obviously this spatial dimension is important, because a lot of the unrest is based around asset-based service work. So around, you know, kind of taxi driving and food delivery. And I think that's because people are able to meet locally as well. And so that's a massive difference. Whereas I just don't think that you're seeing that to the same extent in terms of the online only sort of task work. But of course, that also requires, I mean, there are some good examples coming through, but it's just not to the same extent in terms of the unrest and the sense of solidarity that's emerging there.
Okay, thanks. Okay, we'll take this as the final question. Another question from Joseph Walton. He's wondering if you have any thoughts on how crowd working relates to artificial intelligence, automation, and technological unemployment. Just a small question there to finish.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that one. Well, yeah, I think that they tend to be seen as a bit separate, actually. So I think that crowd work is seen as like real labour intensive, and therefore it's seen as separate from AI, which is almost like the automation of labour. But of course, they're closely linked together, and I think you can't talk about one without the other, really. So not just in terms of like the example that I gave of data sets, but also when you think about, I think one of the problems with platforms actually is that I understand why, this is my focus as well, externally facing labour platforms are important, but also you've got internal labour platforms as well. So if you look at things like Ocado as an example of a platform, Ocado is now seen as a tech firm. It's not an online food delivery service, it's a tech firm. And as a tech firm, of course, they're rolling out their platform and their infrastructure across many different sort of countries and geographies. And in that process, they're also, in terms of the kind of capital that they're attracting, they've just recently bought 2 big AI companies. I think they spent about 250 million on a couple of big AI companies. And the hope with this is, of course, that this platform is then sufficiently capable of doing the picking of the food from shelves, which is something that up to this stage, robots have just not been capable of doing. So they're hoping that this will then shed around 7,000 of their workforce, which is quite a significant number. So yeah, this is a sort of internally facing platform, but you can see the close links between platforms and AI and investment. And of course, one of the things with a lot of the platform companies, of course, if you look at Uber as an example, if you want to remain credible and say that you're a tech firm and attract lots of speculative capital, you have to say that you're much more than just a taxi service. And so you have to prove future potential, and that future potential is often related to AI. So in the case of Uber, it's autonomous vehicles. I think they're also realizing that this is problematic. I think they're trying to flog autonomy at the moment. But you can see that it's about the future, that we are a global logistics infrastructure, which is why we want to do food delivery and logistics generally. And so you can see how they encroach on other areas and link in with AI and technology.
Okay, that's great. So we're out of time. So Deborah, I'd like to thank you for such a great talk and some really good questions and discussion, I think. So thanks for your time today. It's much appreciated. I've got a few final housekeeping points to make. So firstly, I'd like to direct all attendees to the on-screen poll, which has just popped up. So if you could fill this out and let us know what you think about the Digit Debate series, we really value your feedback. Also, I'd encourage you to keep up from all the latest news and events from the Digit Centre, either by following our Twitter handle @DigitCentre or by looking to our website, digit-research.org. Next week's Digit Debates will be given by Professor Duncan Galley, who will be talking about the perspectives on the future of work in the sociology of work. And finally, if colleagues have got any additional comments, then please feel free to send them on to us. So another thanks to Deborah for today's session, and I hope to see you all next week. Thank you very much.